Welcome everyone to this training on fiscal policy. Our focus will be on bold short-term and long-term fiscal policy in Africa, as we know in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the course, I'm going to cover fundamental key topics such as debt and debt sustainability, which is really a top agenda item in many of the policy circles within the continent of Africa, followed by issues of tax collection, because the revenue mobilization or domestic resource mobilization is critical, and non-tax revenue, which is a neglected component of revenue mobilization within the continent, and the complexities and the political economies issues that are associated with that one. We will also look into some household consumption and consumer behavior when it comes to tax compliance in relation to service delivery. So that portion of our training will be a bit extensive. And the final topic that we will cover is this perennial problem of capital flight or illicit financial flows, which is leaving the continent at the expense of resources that could have gone to infrastructure development, social development like education and health. So these are the key topics that we will cover. Module 0 is just an introduction, but at the same time, it covers a lot of the fast changing topics as we witness since the onset of the pandemic. The recent developments are very, very important. Before I go into the elements of the module, I suggest that participants read some components of the reports here and some of the internationally peer-reviewed academic articles. If you read some elements of the reports and the last academic article that I listed on the PowerPoint, it should be fine. Let me make a remark about the African Economic Outlook 2021. This is a report which just came out. It's not even 24 hours since it was launched. I attended the virtual launch, and it was discussed by 2 central bank governors from Africa and by the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and the African Development Bank President Adesina. And there is also another report I would like to draw your attention to, the Economic Report on Africa 2019, which is a fundamental source of what we are discussing in our course overall. But following that report, there is also Economic Report on Africa 2020, which I had the pleasure of peer reviewing. Particularly the chapter on debt and debt sustainability is useful. Even if the report says innovative finance for private sector development in Africa, there are relevant bits that we can really take as a take-home message from that report too. But the African Economic Outlook 2021 focused only on debt issue because that is fundamental. As you know, currently, vaccines, debt, and commodity price fluctuations are big macroeconomic, as well as with a lot of microeconomic implications, problems that face our continent. Before I give you some of the latest thinking and the latest developments and some of the issues that we are grappling with, I will give you a bit of background on fiscal and monetary policy. We know that almost every single country runs a large or a modest or a small budget deficit. The size is different, but many countries are on deficit lines when we look into the balance sheet of governments and the public finance. And most of the deficits that we witness in advanced economies is triggered by demographic change because of the aging population, particularly in Japan and other countries. And also now the budget deficit is hit very hard, or it is expanding exponentially because of the repeated stimulus package that developed countries are announcing. As you know, in the last 48 hours, there was this 1.9 US dollar trillion package, a stimulus package that is approved to really help mitigate the impact of COVID for the United States. And that is a huge lift. There was a bill which was passed also under the Trump administration, we remember. But that one was a tax bill, we should say, because it was disproportionately against the poor and it is not transformational. And the one that is announced recently is transformational, because when the distributional impacts were assessed preliminarily, it indicates that it goes to the lower end of the society, which is fundamental. So the budget deficits are there, but countries such as the US and others can manage it because they can borrow from the capital markets. What about developing and emerging economies? They have deficits, and usually this is caused by lack of public finance management. We admit that we play our part in really expanding budget deficits, but it doesn't mean that there aren't sound macroeconomic management, or we are not saying that there aren't countries with good sound macroeconomic management in the continent. There are, but broadly, we witness that there is some debt excess and also excesses in expenditures without proper follow-up and management of the finances. And another structural problem which contributes to our deficit is the limited revenue sources that we have. And at the same time, the institutional efficiency is not there for collection, even if we have the tax base. And sometimes the fiscal deficit and the public finance position of countries is destroyed because of pure capital flight, which is really a very big problem within the continent. Developed countries, as I said, they can borrow from the capital markets, and the international financial architecture is working against lower developed or least developed countries. So the doors are often closed, and we cannot really borrow from the private capital markets because of systemic problems, lack of coordination at the international level, and also the composition of our debt is changing. Therefore, there are limited options to borrow from the capital markets and really fill gaps in our deficits. Also, to stabilize the macroeconomy, we have very limited sources. That's why there are calls and campaigns from different directions to support poor countries under this pandemic. I said the doors to capital markets is closed, not for every African country, but broadly, the system seems to work against them. One, because they ask time and again when shocks happen to restructure and reschedule their debt, there is a threat by private creditors to downgrade them. And countries have started to feel the pinch because already Ethiopia is downgraded, which was one of the fastest growing developing countries. Zambia has defaulted, and that really doesn't really improve the future prospects of Zambia to borrow from the capital markets. Therefore, we are in a very difficult corner when it comes to our public finances and also the limited fiscal space that we have with all the structural problems that we mentioned just briefly a few moments ago. So budget deficits are major concerns for policymakers. And the government budget constraint and the source of the budget deficits should be studied, and also we should really come up with some solutions. There are monetary policy measures as well as fiscal policy measures. The short-term stabilization is often in the form of interest rate reduction for businesses and individuals. But after the financial crisis of 2008 and COVID-19, there are huge economic downturns, and there is zero bound constraint on normal interest rates, so which limits the usefulness of monetary policies. But at the same time, we can also rely on fiscal policy for short-term stabilization. So, but we have to make also bold statements. That's why the course is called Bold Short-Term and Long-Term Fiscal Policy. And it is a very delicate balancing act, as we will discover as we go along through our course, as well as also the discussion that I will have with you through a webinar. And I hope we will have a lot of controversial, but at the same time, constructive discussion throughout the duration of this course. And I look forward to talk to you, particularly when we have the synchronous webinar. Empirical work also shows that the reduction in taxes and increase in government expenditure might increase aggregate demand and help to lift the economy through expansions in GDP. So from the basic macro point of view, why are we interested in the budget constraint? I will just go through the technical bit a little bit faster, but I felt it is a good background to think in terms of these fundamental basic points. The household budget constraint is such that the present value of its consumption should be at least equal to the initial wealth, which predominantly constitutes earned income plus earned income. Therefore, wage plus wealth should really cover the consumption needs of households. This is what we really know very well. As households have a budget constraint, governments also manage public finances. And this is a balancing act between the present value of purchase of goods and services, but this should be covered with the endowment and the initial wealth that the country has or the government has, plus the tax that it collects net of transfers. This transfers in the form of cash, direct, conditional, and unconditional transfers for social protection or social programs in general. Formally, the government budget constraint can be represented by the following series of equations. The government real purchase is represented by G. T stands for the tax receipts at time T. And the initial outstanding debt is represented by D naught. And this shows that we have some path dependence for sure. There is a certain stock of debt and we keep building and accumulating more and more, but the initial level is D naught. And we have a compounding interest rate over a certain period of time, let's say from an initial starting point until the end time T. And that is given by the equation that you see on the slide. R of T, this compounding interest, is explained by the integral equation that you see. Small r stands for real interest rate. And we know this is computed by combining nominal interest rate and inflation at a point in time. So we have the budget constraint represented by the following equation. The first one covering the purchases of goods and services by government, and the second one, wealth plus tax receipts net of transfers. For sure, on that component, we should have also debt, but it is negative because debt is reducing the wealth. It represents wealth, which is a negative wealth, because we are relying on something that we are obliged to repay at some point in the future. So this constraint doesn't guarantee permanent indebtedness, for sure. Sometimes we can clear it if it is written off, but if not, it will escalate over time. And that is where the problem lies, because we know now we have a lot of countries under debt distress, even if central bank governors may not feel that their government is under stress because they want to hang on to the optimism and rely on pent-up demand, which can really expand the economy at some point in the near future. But unfortunately, under COVID, we were thinking that when it hit us at the beginning of 2020, we were feeling that we may be out of it by the summer of 2020. But now we even passed the winter of 2020, and now we are in the spring of 2021, and we are very far away from normality. So the escalation of D will be prominently clear, and that really pushes a lot of governments into distress. And already we are looking at the signs, because many countries are asking for restructuring. Ethiopia did, Chad did, Zambia defaulted, as we said. So huge challenges for our governments. So the government fails to satisfy its constraint and to repay or pay its debt if real interest rate is positive. So for the budget constraint to be satisfied, the growth of debt should be lower than the real interest rate. So the budget deficit, the simplest definition is to equate it to the rate of change of the stock of debt, as this equation represents. So we have government purchases minus tax and revenue plus real interest rate on debt, or simply from G, we subtract the taxes to get the primary deficit, and adding to that the real interest rate. We have nominal debt, inflation, and budget deficit. Basically, the two first macro points or concepts are simply fundamental components of how we can compute the real interest rate that we were talking about. So the nominal interest rate represented as I. So change in nominal debt is just a difference between nominal purchase and revenues plus the nominal interest rate on debt. So the nominal debt deficit is given by the equation 3. Now we incorporate inflation. Under inflation, the nominal interest rate rises for a given real rate. So this really leads to interest payments and deficit expands. So we are faced with that already. And we know from the simple definition of nominal interest rate as a sum of inflation and real interest rate, or conversely, real interest rate is a difference between nominal interest rate and inflation rate. So the nominal deficit can be rewritten using equation 3 to arrive at equation 4. So these are just simple substitutions. So the effect of inflation is to increase nominal deficit even when the deficit is deflated by prevailing prices. And when we look at the statistics on inflation, there are worrying trends, at least for countries such as Ghana and Ethiopia. So that is a very important point to remember. So what are some of the sources of the deficits? One is the fluctuation in taxes, particularly the unpredictability and also lack of efficiency in collecting taxes. So this tax smoothing or tax volatility leads to a widening of budget deficits, or sometimes the fluctuation or volatility of budget deficits. So it is very destabilizing for the macroeconomy if high tax rates are followed by low tax rates and so on. So a steady level of tax rate is preferable. Inflation, as we mentioned, is the second most important source of deficit, without even raising the stock of debt. Political economy is very, very important. It is more important in the context of Africa because we have been for decades talking about governance, importance of efficient institutions, particularly transparency in the amount of money that we are borrowing, in the amount of money that we are putting aside for debt repayment, and in the amount of debt contracts that we are negotiating with bilateral lenders, private sector lenders, and multilateral lenders. This has been even discussed yesterday when the African Economic Outlook 2021 was launched. And this is the huge problem that we have. One, we have capital flight, rank seeking, and our officials are not really maximizing the welfare of their citizens because they were not really working on the governance side of things as the documents and the political settlements, political commitments suggest. So we have delays in fiscal reforms and also strategic spending because of the incentive to stay in power. There are political business cycles, as we call them. Even the literature is very, very wide in that area, meaning you just spend a lot just before elections and you just leave the economy to its own devices for some time, and again to excessively borrow and spend just before another cycle of elections. And this is really leading to a lot of instability in the economy, and it is hurting every single ordinary citizen. It will not really provide the jobs. It will not really provide the economic social transfer resources that citizens want for their livelihoods, and poverty deepens. So this is really fundamental when it comes to addressing our future problems by tackling the political economy complexities that we are grappling with for decades. The last point, but not necessarily exhausting all the sources of deficits, is the issue of fiscal space. Particularly, the exogenous shocks are against us. For instance, the rich countries have reduced the amount of money that they are giving us. Recently, the UK government was one of the rare advanced economies which is keen on supporting developing countries. It has changed its rate of national income devoted to foreign aid or overseas development assistance from 0.7% of its national income to 0.5%. When a lot of NGOs and international development experts were complaining that this is really undesirable and it will have detrimental impact on development outcomes in developing countries, including those in Africa, the government's position was to say that, no, we are just simply suspending this commitment of 0.7% for a temporary period. And we will move from the current 0.5% of national income to the normal or the most desirable 0.7 in the future. But I doubt it. It may be ingrained as a permanent change in terms of UK's commitment to ODA, which will be really a disaster. Another exogenous shock to which that African countries are subjected to is the impact of the financial crisis, which is not caused by Africa, but caused by greedy bankers, few banks in advanced economies, and economies which are liberalizing both in capital account terms and current account terms, and those who are integrated to the rest of the world will feel it. And because of that, we are in an interdependent economy, we are in an interdependent global economy, and we felt it. But more fundamentally, the fiscal space has been hard hit because of the COVID pandemic. We may say this shock is very, very different, but I will discuss a little bit more what this shock or the nature of the beast is. Because as economists, we are used to economic shocks, but the economic shocks that we are used to is not similar to the economic shocks that we are experiencing now. And I will say more on that. So let me go back to this structural problem that we have when it comes to institutions. Sometimes it is not the lack of resources, but it is a management which is important. This is not just to blame only Africa, but there are peer African governments which are really better in terms of institutional efficiency compared to others. Therefore, there is a lot of wisdom that we can learn from each other, but at the same time, we should really know how much it is detrimental to have weak states when it comes to managing our key ratios like debt to exports or debt to GDP and so on. So political variables are very important and they affect the deficits. In this equation 6, we have a panel specification, assuming that we have data on many countries for many years. And we have a bunch of explanatory variables, which is subsumed in the x variable, which is a vector. So that constitutes a vector of variables like the economy size, proxied by GDP, population, and other macroeconomic variables. But we have another indicator of weak states by having this binary indicator, which is represented by weak IT. So this is the purpose of the empirical evidence, just to show whether that parameter attached to that variable, like beta, whether it is statistically different from 0. So if D, the left-hand side variable, is representing the deficit of a country at time t for a given country I, and it is expressed as a proportion of GDP. And if weak stands for a binary variable or a discrete variable which represents the level of strength of the state, 0 standing for the strongest, 3 to the weakest. And X, as I said, are a bunch of variables which are put into a vector X. So we will see, also we can improve the specification of 6 by including the past value of the deficit. But for now, let's run with the baseline result as it is depicted in equation 6. If the slope coefficient associated with weak, meaning the beta parameter is 0.4, and it is statistically significant, it means that a change in the political variable or the change in the strength of state indicator from 0 to 3 is associated with an increase in deficit ratio by 1.2 percentage points because we have to multiply the coefficient beta 0.4 by 3. But one may ask the following question: do weak governments cause persistent or current deficits or surpluses? To answer this in a satisfactory manner, we can make an interaction between the binary variable or the discrete variable weak and the level of debt or the level of deficit last year. Therefore, when you look at equation 7, we have an interaction term between weak IT and DIT minus 1. DIT minus 1 is the deficit of last year. Because there is state dependence, for sure, this should be a very acceptable specification because the past determines the future as far as it also determines the current state of deficits. So when we make an interaction, for sure, for completeness, always in this given static, in this panel data context, we have to also put the interacted variables separately so that the estimation is going to be following the right econometric protocol. So now we include that, and meaning the impact on deficit or current deficit of the past depends on the strengths of institutions or the strengths of the government. To net the impact of the past as well as impact of the weakness of the state, we can differentiate the equation 7 with respect to dit minus 1, which gives us beta 2 plus beta 3 weak. I think ditu minus 1 is a mistake, so we just have to remove that, because if you differentiate dit with respect to dit minus 1, you just get beta 2. So the persistence of the past deficit can be captured simply by beta 2, but persistence plus weakness can be captured by beta 2 plus beta 3 times weak, meaning the strength of the state. So generally, political economy models predict that beta 3 is greater than 0. So deficit persistence is often higher than beta 2. That means it is higher than deficits in countries without weak states. In simple terms, if we have a weak state, the persistence of past deficits is stronger. Therefore, the countries are working with heavier and heavier budget deficits as we go deeper into the future. And this is the nature of the macroeconomic reality of many of African countries. Okay, we are talking about bold short-term and long-term fiscal policy and also debt sustainability issues in this training. But all these macroeconomic problems that we are confronted with now, they just didn't turn out to be macroeconomic problems because of only COVID. There were some background signals and symptoms that we are building into something very, very challenging. Therefore, we have a lot of accumulation of deficits, we have a lot of accumulation of debt, we have a lot of fiscal policy problems. Now let's zoom into the COVID-19 pandemic. Due to the sudden outbreak of the COVID pandemic, countries were forced to put in place short and bold measures. And we know by classifying countries into different income levels, we see what governments have done. We know that this pandemic started as a public health crisis, which affected everyone, and it has also brought a lot of economic trauma. Therefore, the public finance of many countries is decimated. And already we have weak health systems in Africa and weak public finance stance in many cases. And because of that, we suffer deeply because of the COVID pandemic as well. This includes generous support to households, businesses in rich countries, and suspension of some tax payments in poor countries. And the social protection given in African countries is not great, as we will see from a recent social protection map of the world, and for a good reason, because there is very little room for many African countries to maneuver when it comes to generating some funding for support for survival. So we can imagine that in many African countries, livelihoods are really at their toughest position, and many countries are having an increasing number of unemployed people, and socioeconomic security is destabilized very, very hugely. Already, Africa has had a lot of economic problems, and it is an unwelcome news to have COVID in addition to that. IMF has campaigned to push for cancelling of debts for some of the most poorest countries. And still, its public statements are very, very encouraging. And the biggest problem is the complexity surrounding the lack of transparency in debt contracts and the nature of the partners that are providing the public finance supports as well as the lenders. The fiscal space for social protection is more or less zero in many cases, except for South Africa and Chad on the map. We don't really see any other African country providing any meaningful social protection for their citizens. And we shouldn't blame the countries, but as you can see in this map, if you have a red color, that means the additional spending which is provided to firms and populations in response to COVID is less than 2.5% of GDP. The yellow ones are between 2.5 and 5%, and it keeps increasing. And the green ones, more than 10% of GDP is allocated. And this is at the expense of their future public finance stance. And the rich countries are going to really repay a lot of debt, and most of them are in debts which are much more than the debt that they were in at the end of the Second World War. So the economic trauma globally is massive. But at the same time, as I said, the key point that we shouldn't forget is that even if they are in this public finance position, they have access to the capital markets as well, and they can repay it, and they can come out of it. It will be a long travel or journey to be starting the recovery, and we will be there for many, many years. At least the next 5-10 years will be just a recovery period if we keep really making progress in terms of controlling the pandemic and come out of it. But the prospect is there, but the vaccine distribution is skewed towards rich countries at the expense of poor countries in Asia, Latin America, and Africa, predominantly our continent. So what is special about the COVID as a crisis for us as economists? As I said, we are used to economic shocks in economic history, and these are mainly demand-side shocks, like the Great Recession of 2008, which is primarily a demand-side shock. So that's why we always go to expand aggregate demand and go to printing money and get the economy back on track. Even if we were still in recovery mode, we were confronted with this international pandemic, which is a covariate shock to everyone. But COVID is both a demand side and a supply side shock. So the demand side is expressed by factors such as declines in exports or demands for exports, and also the supply side shock, disruption in production because of lockdown. And this really led many economies to more or less very close to points of collapse. One of the key principles that we know to measure our progress towards 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is to monitor the poverty and inequality statistics. And it is not really encouraging what we are looking at in the last 18 months. For instance, all the progress that we have made is reversed. I think there is an agreement on that. 30 million more people were pushed into poverty because of the pandemic in 2020. And there is unexpected growth. There is also, forecasts also indicate an increased likelihood of falling into poverty to another group of individuals and households and communities to the tune of 39 million. And this is really shocking. This is according to the African Economic Outlook launched yesterday. That is 12th of March in the afternoon. And there is a good news in terms of the growth of economies. The outlook for 2020 was very bad because it was a negative 2.1. If we have another negative, that means we are in the recession zone. But with data accumulation and other macroeconomic policy challenges, we may not be far away from another recession or the first recession in 20 years for Africa. But on the positive note, growth is going to rebound to be a positive one. So it will, Africa on aggregate will grow at 3.4%. The trade statistics is also encouraging, particularly in the last 2 quarters of 2020. So there is some rebounding. But foreign direct investment, ODA, and the rest of it, which is very important to manage our economies in Africa, are not encouraging, particularly because advanced economies are also struggling. So what are the discretionary and other long-term fiscal measures that we can take? Provision of increased services in health, education, and transport. This should be there. This is a bold statement to make, but checked against pragmatic reality and feasibility, it is a big challenge. But in the long run, there is no way of escaping investment in health, education, and transport networks, but particularly in the health systems, because we have to take the experience from Ebola. I remember when I was working for the ECA and assigned to work on the Ebola report, the health system point was raised a lot, and there were a lot of discussions by saying that we have to really improve the health systems of Africa, because if such pandemic or epidemic faces us again, we have to really be more resilient than before. I think to the credit of Africa, the health systems have picked up a bit, even if it is not to a sufficient level. Therefore, we should really give credit to the health systems in some countries. And some countries are really doing quite good progress, like Senegal, in terms of the COVID vaccine, and the other places, South Africa, and so on, even if it is one of the hardest hit country in the continent. Support to businesses. This is at the expense of borrowing a lot, but if you borrow at lower interest rates, because central banks really play a greater role here, that is a good thing. Grants, business rates. Many businesses are closed. For instance, I'm now in the UK. We are not allowed to leave our house except for small walks and to go to the supermarket. Businesses are closed, but businesses are closed and they are expected to pay rents, very expensive rents for their business premises. And there is a government support in the form of grant, not to everyone, but to the majority of the businesses to really be back on track whenever we are allowed to be out of this terrible lockdown. There were also interest rate relief with individual banks discussing the needs of businesses and the postponement of debt repayments, but that doesn't mean that they are not going to pay it. In the future, it will come as accumulated debt repayment. But temporary relief, bold temporary reliefs were given by the banking system, also by the public system, public finance, fiscal instruments. And therefore, both monetary and fiscal policy were used to help businesses and households. In terms of support to households, social protection, furlough schemes, meaning workers are at home, but they are paid, and the government subsidizing the salaries that are paid by the employers. And Germany has this by law embedded in its system. And their self-employment support as well, because there are individuals who are self-employed, but they are not salaried and they don't feature on the payrolls, and they are also supported. And in the future, long-term investment and spending that focus on improving health systems, as I said, and this is very, very important. If we have a bad health system, we will suffer, and this is path dependent. And we will also face another round of epidemics and pandemics in the future. So there is no way of shying away from investment in those areas, such as improvements in health systems. So there are political and economic consequences because of COVID. These consequences are closely linked with our discussion of the future outlook of all economies after COVID, the return of big government. There are debates now, should we have government or not? But that shouldn't be even a debate, because it is clear that whenever there are big shocks and crises, be it a demand side shock or a combination of demand side and supply shocks, the state is playing a key role. Therefore, the Keynesian principle that really supports for state to regulate and stabilize the macroeconomy is a very important point to take home. Therefore, the role of the state is very, very fundamental, and it should be there. We are learning from successive demand shocks. Now we are learning big time with COVID as well. So look at now the interaction between the government and banks. After the financial crisis of 2008, banks were vilified because they were the cause of major financial collapse, which took down the whole global economy with it. But now banks are really at the heart of support for businesses and individuals. And this is very important. I think this will help us also to reconfigure how we can manage economies in the future. So under COVID, a lot of banks played important roles providing quick support for businesses, as opposed to their very infamous story, well, just like 12 years ago when the financial crisis hit us. So now we are rethinking of monetary financing, which might lead to a better coordination of both fiscal and monetary policies. And it is really a good wake-up call also how we should run public finances, particularly in our part of the planet. Debt ratios increased due to additional public sector borrowing, and fiscal deficit deteriorated. This is more increases in expenditures and revenue is an outcome of COVID. And we have deterioration of debt levels, which is more likely to be on a permanent path because we are going to have a lot of accumulation, and many countries are declared as in distress. Interest rates on external finance is likely to be high because of partly the defaulting and partly because of the ruthless private sector lenders who are really threatening governments for repayment. At the same time, the rating agencies are controlled by the rich countries who don't have the incentive to really relieve the pain of poor countries, which is very, very unfair. And then that led to downgrading and also lack of creditworthiness to be the fate of many African countries. Therefore, they face high interest rates in a very depleted fiscal space. So we are facing difficult and protracted recovery period coming into the future. GDP contractions are all encompassing, despite some differences in intensity and severity across countries. And these contractions are worse than the levels witnessed under the Great Recession. Much, much worse than what we have seen from the demand shock that we witnessed 12 years ago. The long-run cost of the pandemic is labor market scarring, it has. And this is seen by the worsening condition of mass unemployment in the continent, particularly for those who are living on daily wages. And we know the structure of our economy should always focus on the informality of the labor market, and we shouldn't ignore that. And the informal operators and informal sector economy participants suffered a lot. So there is a lot of scarring in the labor market. And those who are also working, and because of the lockdown who have lost their work, even formal employees, will be adding into the mass unemployment problems that the continent faces. But at a very, very basic level, we are still a continent that depends on imports of food. And this is really a shame, because macroeconomic problems of inflation and others are not necessarily because of money supply problems. They're coming fundamentally from the lack of the production side. So it is a supply side problem, and we don't have the system, the coordination, and the courage to really work in the area of investing a lot on agriculture and feed our population. And because of the social protection program in Africa is very thin, and there is limited support, as you have seen in the map, we have deterioration in food insecurity. And it is unimaginable to see, after 30 years of the first World Development Report, which focused on poverty, to see a continent which is classified as the only continent with poor people, or the number of poor people increasing. So it is profoundly upsetting to really witness this. Still, we are talking about food insecurity. I did finish my first degree in 1991. I remember reading a lot on malnutrition and food insecurity. I wrote a book chapter just last year on malnutrition and food insecurity almost after 30 years. So this is really a fundamental problem that all Africans should stop and think and work towards transformational agricultural development. When we feed ourselves, yes, we can also battle COVID better. And when we feed ourselves, we can also think about diversifying our economies and providing jobs for the growing number of graduates. So we got it wrong, particularly when it comes to developing our economies and feeding our population. So what are the prospects on policy coordination due to COVID? I think it has shown the worst and the best of humanity. And we know now, in terms of vaccine distribution, Africa is in the last stage when it comes to the queue. All the rich countries, they bought it. And it's shameful to humanity that Africa is left out. Okay, so some countries are starting to vaccinate, such as Senegal today or this week, and other countries like Ethiopia. But that doesn't cover everybody. That is really showing us that there is a huge global policy coordination failure. And this is really symptomatic of our economic order globally, because even the debt situation is not sorted, because bilateral lenders, private creditors, and multilateral lenders with the borrowing countries are not sitting down and working on an international restructuring architecture to really relieve pressures on poor countries or developing countries or least developed countries. But at the same time, there are some countries which are supporting poor economies, and they were pushing and campaigning for COVAX, the vaccine system, whereby the poor countries should really be able to access the COVID vaccine. And there are countries which are pushing for, rich countries that are pushing for debt cancellation for the poorest of the poor. So that's why I said we have some encouraging signs, but generally a global policy coordination failure is the outcome. Okay. Public finance under COVID-19. I start my slide by saying this is not a time for fiscal tightening, but I left it ... I say but because I heard finance ministers and central bank governors saying that we have started fiscal consolidation, and I don't blame them, because fiscal consolidation meaning you are really reducing expenditure because you are working under limited revenue sources, and you are really showing some prudence. So this prudence is being pursued, but it is a very difficult objective to pursue because of the ethical considerations that come to mind. Because if you tighten and if you are really limiting expenditures, particularly transfers to support social programs, transfers for social protection, if those are not there, a majority of the poor will be scarred even worse than they used to be before COVID. So the economic trauma is being felt, and the public finances are really decimated. Fiscal space is really devastated. Emerging economies and advancing economies have suffered, but as I told you, there is a way out. Always this access to capital markets helps them. The situation of Africa is worse because we rely on foreign aid, basically, or foreign investment, or remittances. And the looming crisis in remittances was also discussed by the Economist Intelligence Unit at the beginning of this week. So a lot of huge problems we have. And we discuss the capital flight problems that we know very well. The strain in public finance is expressed in the following forms: increased social spending, if we have spent, or spending on health sector, acquisition of personal protection equipment, sometimes in donation, and most of the times we have to buy it, and sometimes of poor quality. Reduced tax revenue due to shrinking business environment, and we have increasing and expensive domestic and external public debt. Okay. And the situation on the public finance in general is going to be worse because we are still in the crisis, and nobody expected that it is going to last this long, and it is lasting longer than we expect. So what are some of the macroeconomic measures due to COVID? So fiscal or public finance absorption of private sector losses, support to households losing jobs, business that suffer economic slowdown due to COVID, because of the social distancing and the lockdowns and the partial closing, and also the complete closing of businesses. Some concrete support, supporting firms through banks, particularly in the reduction of interest payments and rescheduling. Grants to businesses so that they mitigate the impacts of partial and complete lockdowns, providing loan guarantees for businesses, sometimes requiring almost zero interest payments, particularly focusing on SMEs, small and medium enterprises, because they need more support to survive. Otherwise, most are going to be closed down. And also the furlough scheme, which supports employees in payrolls. And other measures are focused on important institutions such as central banks. Under two, central banks realize the importance of providing emergency finance for the public sector. So they ensure that government borrows at lower rate or at zero rate, so that it will have a room to maneuver and the physical space for stabilization. Third, governments put in place fiscal stimulus packages to fill the existing financing gap, which widens during the pandemic. So this is for sure is happening in advanced and emerging economies, and to a limited extent in some African countries. The problem is you have a fiscal stimulus package announced at a given cycle or a budget cycle, and we have to repeat it, because the longer we stay in the pandemic, the longer we have, or the larger the number of stimulus packages that we have to provide. So we will have a first generation, second generation, third generation of stimulus packages. And even to make one cycle of stimulus packages, the most difficult step to make in Africa. Christopher Adam in the University of Oxford and his colleagues have done some interesting work on macroeconomic measures. And there are some interesting insights on key macroeconomic and public finance policies required to sustain recovery, growth, and poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa. They contend that all public policy options are not encouraging given the grave public finance implications of the pandemic, which is consistent to what we were saying so far. The options for domestic measures for recovery and mitigation of the crisis depends on, to some extent, on international support. And I want to underscore that that is really fundamental. We are devastated. The trauma in the economies of Africa is huge. Therefore, they should be supported. But we have to be careful also not to incentivize ill discipline in fiscal terms and also incentivize the weak states. And we will discuss, I think, specific mechanisms in those terms when we have the webinar or in the lectures that I will also record. However, donors themselves are under extreme public finance strain, with some even entering into historical debt levels. As I told you already, some have taken a step to reduce their international support. So we are in the worst of worst situations. There are very limited sovereign borrowing possibilities, so the recourse should be to official financing. Institutions such as IMF provided some emergency funding and financing, but this is insufficient if there isn't sufficiently high injection via overseas development assistance. So in the last decade, ODA has declined, but now we have to really have a different model. This is not the period where ODA should decline. Whatever diversity of economic potential and borrowing capacity exists within the continent, all countries face a difficult future given the global recession unleashed due to the pandemic. And there is a table in Adam's paper, which you will see when you look into the narrative notes of the course. Now, I want to focus a little bit on the local government issue, because we know that we have a growing urban center in every country in Africa, but we have also huge and big provinces with good resources, but with limited support maybe. Therefore, local governments and provinces in every country shouldn't be forgotten. There shouldn't be an urban bias when it comes to helping economies in Africa to recover from COVID. Most COVID-19 related fiscal effects are focused on national or federal level with little attention to local government and the service delivery challenges they face with shrinking budget. We need to recognize fiscal disparities and social inequities with a special attention paid to small local governments of limited capacity. Otherwise, it will be morally unfair to do so. The budget strain due to COVID-19 leads to a re-evaluation of priorities at all levels of government in terms of revenue collection, postponement of payment of income taxes, and also fiscal allocation to local government. In terms of the medium to long-term outlook, the impact of COVID coupled with outstanding economic problems that we brought from the past should really lead to a reorientation of our economies, or in simple terms, in macro circles, we call it economic restructuring. So this restructuring is often seen in different economies after major economic shocks. For instance, you remember after the financial crisis of 2008, regulation came into the picture because regulation of financial institutions was in documents but never implemented. But the way we look into regulation and the role of the state has dramatically changed immediately after that demand shock that we faced in 2008. Now, after COVID, I think the way we think about even green growth, meaning sustainable development, sustainable economic development, should really be different. And we should be ready for making transition to renewable energy sources and reorient the way the economic path is charted. Otherwise, if we are trying to solve every single shock with the same old tricks, we will not go far. So something transformational should come, and a new economic order should follow, because the way we manage our economies it should really change. And it should be clear to us what is really a priority, human survival, and also the survival of the planet. So restructuring aimed at supporting victims of shocks, and restructuring which is focused on reducing poverty, which is a structural problem, and also inequality. Even when we pass social protection programs, like the stimulus package, for instance, announced in the US, we should make sure that it is distributionally sensitive towards the population in the lower half of the economy. That way, I think we can lift our respective economies in Africa. Under COVID, victims are several due to the covariate nature of the shock, for sure. There are losers, and there are also who gained, particularly those who invested a lot in the technology part have really benefited a lot. In the process of any economic restructuring or transformation in the context of the medium to long run, we expect changes in employment and unemployment levels and investment in different sectors, transport, health, technology, and so on. And we hope, because we have a positive forecast in terms of GDP growth, we may come out in the form of recovery better than we are in 2020, because 2021 is a critical year when it comes to recovering from this pandemic. So this is what I have for you as an introduction. I'm sure you have noticed that I raised a lot of several points, and these are going to be the foundations for the discussion of topics such as tax revenue mobilization, non-tax revenue mobilization, efficiency of tax administration, public finance management, illicit financial flows out of the continent, and how we can really manage also the proceeds that we get from positive commodity markets prices. Because during the pandemic, oil prices and natural resource endowed countries have suffered because of the decline. But now oil prices are increasing a lot, and we should have some management of that, because if we don't really careful, if we are not careful in managing the proceeds of higher commodity prices, and if we are not careful of orderly resolution of our accumulating debt, we will still suffer a lot. And COVID is a terrible experience, and it's a terrible pandemic, which makes it worse. So thank you for listening, and I hope I will also have a very lively and fruitful discussion with all of you when I also see you in person, at least online, when we have the webinar and discuss a lot of issues. And I'm not really standing here just to teach you, but to learn a lot from your experience as well. Thank you very much, and have a good day.